So, welcome. We're just people coming into the virtual room. Okay, good morning. I'm Jonathan Carr West. I'm Chief Executive of LGIU, Local Government Information Unit, and I'm delighted to welcome you all here this morning to another edition of LGIU's Ask the Expert event series. This is a series of events we do exclusively for you, our LGIU members. So we're delighted to have you all here today and really looking forward to getting into some of our latest research on local government finance in Scotland, released today, which you're going to hear about in a minute. This is the second time that we've surveyed Scottish councils about finance, and the results make for some interesting and frankly slightly alarming reading, as some of you may already have seen. We're going to hear all about that from Dr. Greg Stride, who's our researcher who leads on this. But before I pass over to Greg, I just wanted to take a moment to briefly highlight, as you're all LGIU members, how the team here at LGIU can continue to support you beyond today's session. So, as you know, we are a not-for-profit, non-partisan membership organisation for local government. We believe in local democracy, we believe in local government, and we know that all of that works only because of the work that people like you do in councils across the country. Those councils which are fundamental bedrocks of the places we live in, the places we work in. So we want to support local government, support the work that all you're doing, that you are all doing. We do that through research, through briefings, through daily news, through events, through networks. We want to make sure that you're informed, engaged, connected, and heard. So we're here for you. We hope you'll continue to use our extensive resources. Do take a look around our website, get involved in our research, share your stories and experiences with us and with our growing community of 300 councils across the UK, Ireland, and Australia. So thank you to all of you for your sterling work. Thank you for your support of LGIU. I'm now going to pass over to Greg, who's going to tell us about the findings of our second State of Local Government Finance survey in Scotland. Greg, over to you.
Thank you very much, Jonathan. I'm just going to share my screen. And as I'm sharing my screen, I'll talk a little bit about what the plan is for today. So I'm going to be talking for, I would say, roughly half an hour. Oops, wrong button. I'm going to say roughly half an hour. And then from there, can you see that all right, Jonathan?
Yes.
Yeah, okay, perfect. From then, we're going to have a discussion. This bit that I'm doing will be recorded, but the discussion won't be. Please feel free to write any questions you have in the chat throughout the talk, or you can say them after I've finished at the end. So this is, as Jonathan said, the 2024 State of Local Government Finance Survey report, which has been released this morning. We've done one last year. We've been doing it in England for over a decade. Last year, the results were I would say, quite shocking in Scotland. We had hoped to go in with a sense of optimism. We thought, surely Scotland can't be quite as bad as England, but everything we were hearing was saying, oh, things are not so good in Scotland. We went into Scotland. Our Scottish members told us the issues that were going on. We did a survey and things looked pretty bad. So this year, we've taken a slightly different tack. We've said, okay, we understand that things are not so good in Scotland. We were checking again to see if anything had changed, but then we were also looking at the reforms, at the adjustments that needed to be made, and at the solutions that we could come up with. So, without any further ado, what was this research? So it was a survey open from the 17th of October to the 5th of November, about 3 weeks, and we sent it to all leaders, chief executive officers, and chief finance officers in Scotland, the total being around 96. Some of these jobs may not have been filled at the time, so it's not exactly 96. But the reason that that is important is because we got 56 responses, which is over half of the population of Scottish senior local council figures. We also got responses from 84% of Scottish councils and responses from roughly equal number of leaders, CFOs and CEOs. I think it was something like 19, 18, 18. So we really did manage to get the wide, broad swathe of Scottish local government opinion in this survey. We also received responses from every major type of Scottish local authority. Big urban authorities, rural authorities, mixed urban and rural authorities, and island authorities all responded. So we can be quite confident about the results of this survey and how representative it is of the whole population of Scottish local government finance officials and politicians, of course. So that's all the preamble out of the way. Let's get into the results. The first thing we asked about was confidence in the sustainability of Scottish local government finances. Now, to remind everybody, in 2023, one respondent said they were confident in the sustainability of local government finances. This year, that reduced to no respondents. though absolutely nobody said they were confident, which is quite shocking. I mean, it was only 1 last year, so it can only fall by a small amount, but it fell by that amount. We also asked another question, a new question this year. If there are no changes to local government funding, how likely do you think it is that your council will be unable to pass a balanced budget? And we gave 2 different timescales. So in the next financial year, 2025 to 2026, 27% said they thought it was either likely or very likely. In the next 5 years, 71% said it was either likely or very likely. Now, as a point of comparison, in England, this proportion is about 50%. So in Scotland, the confidence in the sustainability of local government finances, in the capacity that local governments have to balance their books, is even lower than it is in England. The thing that's remarkable about this and startling is that in Scotland, this hasn't happened yet. In England, we've had the issuing of Section 114 notices. We've had people say, we simply can't pass a balanced budget, and there's a legislative process that they have to go through in England. In Scotland, there is no such process, but we would still be able to tell that Scottish councils wouldn't be able to pass a balanced budget. We've written a paper with CITFA that came out last month where we get into this. Maybe we can share that in the chat for anyone who hasn't seen it. We get into what exactly would happen if there was an unbalanced budget. But really the point from this survey is to say, the chance of this happening is increasing by the day, and we need to have some sort of plan for what we're going to do if it does happen. As one respondent said, I'm not sure what it will take for any change, but I am certain at least one council will go bankrupt within the next 2 years, and we'll see if that makes any difference. So really, this is moving from a sort of, putting your finger in the air saying, oh, okay, maybe it will happen at some point, to a real danger, warning, red lights saying that this is probably going to happen at some point very soon, and we need to know what we're going to do about it. We also asked some questions about what the sector looks like in 2024. So we were wondering, have any of the pressures on the sector changed since 2023? And I have to say, because we asked roughly the same questions, actually the pressures on the sector appear to be pretty much exactly the same in 2024 as they were in 2023. So you have, I'll go through each of these in turn, just to explain what we heard in the survey about each of these pressures. The only one that changed a little bit was the cost of living crisis pressures, which reduced from something over 90% last year to about 85% this year. Maybe that's because the cost of living crisis is the burdens are being eased, perhaps, or maybe it's for some other reason. It's quite difficult to say, but also we shouldn't put too much store in that because it's only a very small change in the proportion saying that it's an issue. It's still the vast majority of Scottish councils saying that the cost of living crisis is an issue. To just dig down into some of these to explain what we heard, additional pressures caused by demographic change were described as a problem by everybody that answered this question in the survey. Now, this sort of makes it look like there's quite a unified issue that's affecting Scottish councils, but when people wrote about this in their written responses, they raised a huge number of different demographic changes that are causing problems in different councils. So in some councils, it was depopulation, people moving away from the council, which causes pressures like it's hard to recruit anyone. If you don't have a working age population or your working age population is reducing, it makes it very, very hard to do any work because you can't employ people. On the other hand, you had councils that said our population is increasing all the time, which causes huge pressures to housing. So population movement is causing different issues in different places. You also had the perennial issue, and it will continue to be an issue for, for at least the 50 years that all the forecasts are going on. And you can look in the ONS data on these, the aging population. So this continues to be a pressure on councils. If you look at any of the graphs that describe the age of the population, it's increasing exponentially. So it's increasing at a faster and faster rate every year. And the amount that's being spent on adult social care, for example, increases in proportion to that. So the more the population ages, the more that councils have to spend on adult social care. That is unlikely to change. So when it comes to demographic changes, I think this survey has quite accurately managed to pick out one of the things that is going to be a big issue for Scottish councils, and we'll come back to it in a minute on the particular question of adult social care. The costs of spending directed by Scottish Government priorities at 98% and the ring fencing of local authority budgets at 92% come as sort of a package. So these are the ring fencing and directed spending that mean that Scottish Government can tell local authorities, well, we want you to spend money on X thing. And just to choose one example, the example that came up most often, the teacher numbers, is one of these areas where Scottish Government has a clear priority. Local authorities have to keep their pupil teacher ratio at a certain rate. And if they don't, then there's potential financial sort of repercussions. This was described as a problem by nearly everyone in the survey. I would say as close to everyone as makes no difference. And this has come up in all the research we've done on Scotland over the last few years, and pretty much every conversation we've had, and everything that our members say to us over the years. That the effect of ring fencing and directed spending cannot be overstated in Scottish local authority finances. The other thing that's important to say about this, actually, two things that are important to say about this. One of them is that the Verity House Agreement was very clear that the aim was to move away from ring fencing and directed spending. And as I'll come back to later in the survey, there's great skepticism about how far this has gone. The other important thing to say about ring fencing and directed spending is that this is something where Scotland compares very unfavorably, even to England, where this is an issue. So it's about 50%, I think, of English local authority leaders and senior figures say that this is an issue in England. So quite a bit lower. Actually, it might be 2/3 now, but quite a bit lower than it is in Scotland. In an international perspective, where we've done lots of research recently that we can share, and if you haven't already seen it, somewhere like Italy, ring fencing and directed spending is straightforwardly unconstitutional. You're not allowed to do it because local authorities have financial autonomy that's enshrined in the constitution. So in Scotland, this is a problem for nearly every local authority in comparison to Italy, where if it happens, you can take the government to court. So very, very different. Just to move on to a couple, inflation and the cost of living crisis, I'm going to sort of move past quite quickly because we sort of saw this in 2023, and the issues here are unlikely to change. You know, inflation makes everything more. I mean, they'll change as inflation and the cost of living crisis sort of lessen, if they do lessen. Inflation makes everything more expensive. That's the issue there, and the cost of living crisis increases demand for services. Recruiting and retaining the staff necessary for essential service provision. If you go into our report, we've written loads and loads about the different issues that are being caused by this. But essentially what I want to emphasize here is that the recruitment and retention of staff is a problem at every level of the council. And this is something that came up very frequently. It's hard to employ senior directors. It's hard to find senior directors. It's hard to employ professional technical staff, people like ICT, planning, legal services. It's hard to employ them, and it's hard to employ frontline staff, particularly in the care sector. This is an issue across the board. There wasn't really anyone saying, oh, you know, it's relatively easy to employ certain types of staff. As you can see, 96% said that this is an issue. And usually, as the report demonstrates, this was because it's hard for local government to appear to be an attractive employer in comparison to the private sector when wages are sort of lower, but also the flexibility that local government could provide that it was difficult for the private sector to do, or that the private sector didn't want to do, like flexible working, for example. The private sector has now moved into that space. Also, there were issues with local authorities sort of gunning for the same people. Neighbouring local authorities wanted to employ the same people, and of course, there's not enough of them to go around. Just to point out, this little bar here with maybe 2 people said that they agreed with it, or agreed that it was a problem. Inefficiencies in council spending leading to significant waste of resources is not seen as an issue by local authorities, which is good. Okay, on service pressures. So I mentioned that the aging population is a huge issue. These are the short-term pressures that local authorities are facing. Adult social care, over half of local authorities said it was the biggest short-term pressure. This is a greater proportion than last year, and it might represent the continuing increase in demand for adult social care and the cost of adult social care. Then education, including additional learning support or special educational needs. This is considered to be a problem by 17% of respondents, or the main problem by 17% of respondents, similar with children's services, and then 8% with housing and homelessness. These are the big short-term pressures facing local authorities. Education came up very, very frequently in the written responses, particularly in terms of teacher numbers, but really adult social care looms large over the entire debate. And one of the reasons it looms so large is because when you talk about long-term pressures, adult social care is by far the greatest long-term pressure. We're looking at 3/4 of local authority senior figures saying that adult social care is likely to be the greatest long-term pressure, and presumably this is because of the increase in demand over time. We asked, what are you doing to balance your budget? So these are, what were your plans, or what are your plans for 2025-26, or your provisional plans for the next financial year? And we can see in this case, and this is sort of what we expect to see by this point, because there are so few things that Scottish local authorities can do to balance their budget, nearly everyone we spoke to is pulling all of these levers. So increasing fees and charges, which is not an extremely good way to raise lots of money. It tends to be quite minor. Every respondent said they were doing. Increasing council tax, every respondent said they were doing. Cutting spending on services, nearly every respondent said they were doing. And I think one of them was a don't know answer rather than being a no. So pretty much everybody who has set out what they're doing is cutting spending on services. Spending reserves, this is one that's we really need to look out for, is at 90%. Now, on the reserves point, I should say we've commissioned and we're publishing a briefing on reserves next week, written by one of our finance associates, because reserves is one of these huge areas of complication because councils can plan to spend their reserves. So this doesn't necessarily mean, oh, we're spending our reserves to make up for issues that exist. But in the written responses, we did see lots of people saying, yes, we are unsustainably spending our reserves. We spent them last year, we're spending them this year, and this is a bad sign. It's not always a bad sign that councils have reserves, but in the written responses we saw, the respondents were saying, yes, this isn't the best news. And actually, if our reserves run out, we're in a serious problem here. I think it was about 80% of respondents said that they spent reserves this financial year and were planning to spend them next financial year as well. So this is getting into a sort of unsustainable position for council finances there. Then we have we have three down here that are primarily figured less in the debate for different reasons. So selling council assets and increasing borrowing are both being done by some councils. In selling council assets, 2/3 of councils are doing this. Again, selling council assets isn't really a sustainable way to fund capital budgets because eventually you run out of assets. It's a short-term solution. Increasing borrowing, about 1/3 said they were doing it. I'm mainly talking about revenue budgets in this presentation, but we do have a whole section on capital budgets in the report that I would recommend anybody interested go and read. These things to do with borrowing and selling assets are primarily to do with capital budgets. Although I'd be interested to hear in the discussion any reflections anybody else has on capital budgets. Increasing commercial activity up at 2/3. The thing about increasing commercial activity, and we've seen this in England, in Scotland, for anyone who's not aware on the call, although I know we have many experts on the call, Scottish local authorities are more restrained in what they can do in terms of commercial activity than English local authorities. They don't have the general power of competence. There are still things that they can do, but they tend to not raise a huge amount of money in most places. And the thing that's most important to note here is that the amount of money you can raise through commercial activity is pretty much unrelated to the amount of money you need to run your services. They're sort of not really a convenient way in which these two things are aligned. So councils, the important thing to note from this slide is that councils are pulling every lever available to them. And the important thing to note from our international research is that in Scotland, the number of levers available to councils is extremely low, especially when increasing council tax isn't one they can always rely on, particularly last year where we saw the surprise freeze in council tax announced by the First Minister. So about council tax, we asked what scale of council tax are you planning this year? It looked roughly the same as the graph of what scale of council tax were you planning last year. The important thing to note here is that nearly everybody said they were increasing council tax by over 5%. The approximate level of the compensation from Scottish Government last year was at the 5% level. As most respondents to our survey said last year, if you freeze it 1 year, the base stays the same level and you'll have to increase it more later on down the line. That appears to be the case. I think this is still a situation where council tax, you can expect council tax to rise as demand pressures and service costs increase. I'm not going to spend too long talking about this, but maybe we'll talk about it in the discussion. On service reductions, we said, which of these services are you planning to reduce? And again, the thing I want to emphasize here is the sheer diversity of different services that are being reduced across different councils. So back office and corporate services, the administrative roles that are there to keep councils going, but are not necessarily frontline, they're being reduced by 90% of respondents. That is roughly similar to what we saw last year. So back office and corporate services are consistently taking the hits from this. Business support and other various services that are non-acute services like parks and leisure, arts and culture, libraries. We see lots of these in the top level, but also things like education services taking cuts. Adult social care, even down here with 61%, is not a small proportion of people cutting adult social care. I think the thing to take from this is that across the board, there are services being cut. Really, regardless of the type of service. There are a few that aren't seeing as many cuts, particularly homelessness support, and we'll come into why that is right now. We asked a new question about service quality. So essentially we asked, how satisfied are you with the following services that you're able to provide? This is quite a difficult question. And I think it's one that was worth asking, even if the results take some interpretation. We can see that relatively levels of satisfaction with recycling and waste, education, libraries are quite high at around the 60% mark. I don't know if that's high enough. And if you look at some international examples, then satisfaction with services tends to be a bit higher. Satisfaction with homelessness support, which is the one area where reductions were considered, oh, well, the proportion reducing it were lower, is satisfaction with homelessness support is quite low. 42% satisfied, 38% actively dissatisfied. So this might be a case of homelessness support. We've been cutting and cutting and cutting it already. It's at the point where if we cut it anymore, it will be completely dissatisfactory as a service. That's how I would interpret this. It could also be there's simply no more money to cut from it. There's different ways you can interpret that. The most interesting one I would say here is the education services at 2/3 satisfaction. This is interesting because education services is also one where we're seeing a few cuts. It's also the one where the majority, or not the majority, but a large amount of the debate lies around the Scottish Government directed spending. So if we're being directed to spend on a service where we think the quality is already quite high, then that will take away from the services where the quality, the estimated quality is significantly lower. I know this is quite a complex graph, so it's in the report for anybody who wants to go and read it and interpret it in there using their own expertise as well. Now, on from this, we also asked a few questions on specific questions on the quality of services overall, and here we saw a lot more unity in the responses. So we asked what proportion, well, we asked, do you agree? How far do you agree with this statement? Cuts to services will have a negative impact on quality of life in your council. 96% of respondents agreed. Cuts to services increase the risk to vulnerable people in your council. 94% agreed. So realistically, when it comes to service cuts, even if service quality is relatively high in some areas, in places, in things to do with quality of life and the risk to vulnerable people, these areas where the cuts will have an effect, according to our respondents. Now, the most important bar in this graph, even though it's also the smallest, is this one. There is a danger that, well, actually, they're all really important, particularly the vulnerable people one. Maybe I shouldn't have put it that way, but this is an important finding as well. There is a danger that financial constraints will put your authority in a position where you no longer have enough funding to fulfill your statutory duties in 2025-26. 45% agreed with this statement. That's much, much higher than the 24-ish%, around a quarter of local authority respondents who agreed with that last year. So people are now more and more worried that they won't be able to fulfill their statutory duties, the legal obligations that councils have to do, which will leave them open to litigation, potentially, and will also mean that councils are not providing the things that their citizens expect of them. This is in contrast to the around a quarter who think they won't be able to balance their budget. So one of the things we can see here is that potentially we're in a situation where more people are unable to provide services that they should be providing than are actively unable to pass their budget. And the difference between these two things is something that I think we need to think quite carefully about, and something that it would be interesting to hear perspectives on. Right, on to central local relations. This is not the most optimistic part of the presentation, I have to say. So we asked, how happy are you, or how far do you agree with this statement? I am happy with the Scottish Government's performance on, and then we asked a series of different, we gave a series of different statements. So understanding the scale of problems facing local government finances, 12% said they were happy with this. Making transparent decisions about council finances, 6% of respondents said they were happy with Scottish Government's performance on this. Providing enough clarity to allow councils to plan their finances, under 5% said they were happy with it. So across the board, there's serious dissatisfaction in local government with the actions of Scottish Government. On 3 of these, honouring the terms of the Verity House Agreement, delivering a sustainable funding system, and considering local government in wider policy decisions, nobody said they were happy with the performance of Scottish Government. This is quite staggering in a way. We also asked a couple of other questions on specific points. So only a single respondent agreed with the statement that the Scottish Government has listened to the needs of the sector when forming the budget. So again, there's this communication between central and local that appears to be highly dissatisfactory on the local side. And only 2 respondents agreed that the Verity House Agreement has improved the working relationship between Scottish and local government. So again, satisfaction with Verity House as a means to improve central local relations appears to be very, very low. This is following on from last year, where lots of people referenced the council tax freeze as a reason that they saw Verity House as not particularly working. We can see that at least from the perspective of local government senior figures, the relationship between central and local is in a pretty terrible state from the evidence of this survey. As we were writing this, COSLA and the Scottish Government produced their stock take on Verity House a year on. And I think that was a very good bit of work for talking about the shared priorities of Scottish and local government. There was lots of analysis of, oh, we're doing this on child poverty, and it was all positive in that respect. Where I think that there is still a space is for surveys like this to look at, okay, when it comes to the principles that underpin the Verity House Agreement, things like the principle of no surprises, the principle of reducing ring fencing and directed spend, how happy are you with the progress that's been made? And I think that would tell a slightly different story to what we saw in the stock take, although I'd be very interested to hear responses to that. This is the main sort of message we heard on central local relations as exemplified in a single quote. What actually transpires in practice is far more important than any agreement. And this is kind of the idea that the actions, particularly taken by Scottish Government in things like the council tax freeze, tell a different story to what the agreement was meant to be about, I think. And that's the main message that we heard from Scottish local authorities this time around. However, to get to a more optimistic part, there were areas where local authorities were very keen to talk about the prospects for reform and also the potential that local authorities can have to improve the lives of citizens and work on Scottish Government shared priorities, national and local shared priorities, I should say. So we asked about various different policies, and we asked the question of, how far do you agree that this policy would have a positive effect on your council's finances? Multi-year financial settlements, 96% said it would have a positive impact on their council's finances. This is obviously very difficult for reasons involving the Barnett formula and the funding of Scottish Government, but we can come back to ways in which this might be possible, and also we can look into whether there is a way that this can be done in the current fiscal envelope. I know the UK government is obviously looking at more long-term spending priorities at the moment, so maybe there's a way that this can be squared across all these different reforms. Ending ring fencing, one of the principles in Verity House, 96% were in favour of it. This is unsurprising because it comes up so often as a problem in local authority financing. Reforming council tax, 78% agreed that reforming council tax would be a good idea. When we asked about council tax, the main issues that came up were essentially that it's too regressive. It doesn't actually raise a huge amount of money. It's not very buoyant in comparison to other taxes. It doesn't tend to go up at the rate at which you'd like it to go up. In the case of something like VAT or income tax, it tends to increase as the economy increases. Council tax doesn't necessarily do that. Which brings me on to a local share of national taxes like VAT or income tax or capital gains tax. This was considered to be positive by 75% of local authorities. Really interesting. This is higher than it is in the equivalent English survey. And I think it points to the idea that a diversification of funding sources would be useful for local authorities. They don't just have to rely on the tiny number of levers that we talked about before. Ending competitive bids for funding, this is a positive one. So 71% said that this would have a positive impact on their council's finances. The UK government has committed to ending competitive bids in the form of things like the Levelling Up Fund. So, I mean, hopefully we'll see an end to them totally across all levels of government. That would be good. Would prevent people wasting their time on unsuccessful bids. Having more freedoms to levy other local taxes. Again, this is about the diversification of funding sources. We've already seen some progress in this area in the visitor levy or tourism tax that's come in. But yeah, this was considered to be useful by 67%. And then single local budgets across all public services. We kind of put this one in to test the water. This was considered to be positive by only 27% of respondents. So there's not a clear move towards place-based budgeting in the way that we've heard several high-profile think tanks talk about in recent years. Interestingly. So on the conclusions, confidence in the sustainability of council finances is critically low. Only a grand total of 0 people said they were confident. 70% of all councils believe they could be unable to pass a balanced budget within the next 5 years. And I should point out again that this is a warning rather than a prediction. This is local government saying this is what could happen if nothing changes, rather than this is what we think is going to happen. Definitely, and we have the numbers right in all of this. Times are increasingly hard for local authorities. There's ongoing pressures from the cost of living crisis and inflation. And then there's long-term challenges like demographic change, the financing of Scottish Government priorities increasingly coming up, and pressures with the recruitment and retention of staff. Councils are taking every measure available to balance their budget. They're raising council tax when they can. They're reducing expenditure, increasing fees, charges, and increasing commercial activity. These are pretty much everything they can do. I've also put in there they're sharing services. This is something we heard quite a lot about, is shared services between local governments. It's quite difficult to get a handle on the extent of which services are being shared or the possible savings that can be made from efficiencies in that respect, but that is something that councils are doing. However, despite all of this, many councils believe this will still not be enough to prevent the risk of an unbalanced budget. Satisfaction with the Scottish Government is alarmingly poor across the sector. Not a single respondent said they were happy with Scottish Government's performance on delivering a sustainable funding system or considering local government in wider policy decisions. The sector is in favour of widespread reform, including multi-year financial settlements, ending ring fencing and reform of council tax, and something that it's difficult to get into in this presentation, but something that comes out very, very clearly in the report. The sector is very optimistic about the role that local government, sufficiently funded and empowered, could have to advance the prevention agenda, tackle local and national shared priorities, deliver services, and empower communities. If there's one thing that we heard in the survey, very, very loud and clear, it's that local government believes that if they were sufficiently empowered and funded, they could do a lot more. And one of my favorite quotes that came out of the survey is someone said, "We help people like their lives. We want people to like their lives." And I really, really like that. Just the idea that what councils are there to do is to not only protect the vulnerable, but also to increase quality of life for everybody in a specific place. In terms of our recommendations, we have a few specific recommendations. Immediate recommendations include that there should be an agreed national convention between Scottish Government and local government to cover procedures and actions that would take place to set a balanced budget if it's ever not possible. This is something we called for in our paper with CIPFA, where we did research with chief finance officers. The idea here being that at least there should be a conversation about what's going to happen if a council ever can't pass their balanced budget before it happens, rather than waiting until we're already gone too far. This convention could be chaired by an organisation like LGIU, and we're in early talks with CIPFA to talk about how we can get these conversations going before it is too late. We believe you should implement and enshrine in legislation the principles of the Verity House Agreement and commit to an annual review by Scottish Parliament covering the key principles. In the report, we go into a bit more detail in this. Essentially, we believe that it should be there should be a third party that's involved in looking at the values of Verity House across the board, everything that was referenced in the Verity House Agreement, and looking into how far Scottish and local government are meeting the terms of Verity House. Because one of the main positive things we heard about Verity House is that what it does provide is a yardstick against which to measure progress. And I think this is a really important point, is that even if Verity House Agreement so far, according to local government, hasn't helped very much to increase central-local relationships, there is still a way that we believe it could be used in that way. In terms of longer-term changes, local government finance should, with urgency, be reconsidered as a whole system approach to funding. Considering wider public finances, this is something I haven't talked about much in the presentation, but IJBs came up very, very frequently, as did the NHS, and the way in which local government and the NHS sort of coexist, and the ways in which they're spending on essentially the same thing, health, is not completely in alignment. We also thought that this review could look into the suitability of every aspect of council finances, like council tax, the funding formula, increasing the range of revenue raising options, methods for redistributing funding between territories, and should be linked to a review of the role of councils in Scotland. I haven't spoken about this much, but the role of local government came up very frequently, with the primary idea being, as in other places that we've looked at, Italy, Germany, Japan, for example, Ireland, there should be an attempt to set out the role of local government more clearly, with an aim to confirming and then protecting through statute the exact roles, powers, and responsibilities of local government. So it shouldn't be a case that local government's roles and responsibilities shift with the wind. It should be that local government has, in some way of protecting what it's there to do, and some way of protecting its own powers and responsibilities against any changes that might come in. And then we also believe, and this is something that we've recommended across the UK, that Scottish and local government should be brought together in a standing commission or representative body, which should be defined in statute, with a key role in pre-budget engagement processes, negotiation of the funding settlement, and any and all decisions that have an impact on councils. We do think that the exact responsibilities and membership of this body should be a matter for future discussions, but should at a minimum include ministerial representation. And in England, we've seen, well, across the UK, we've seen an attempt to do something similar to this, although not defined in statute, in the Council of Nations and Regions. And in England, we're being promised a council of council leaders, that would also have some sort of similar effect, although we haven't seen much detail on that council of leaders. But this, we believe, could really help to make sure that there's a place where it can be publicly scrutinised, the relationship between Scottish and local government has a hand in everything that happens that is relevant to local government. I'm going to stop waffling on now. Thank you all very much for listening. And I should say a huge thank you to everybody in the audience today who was involved in the survey. We couldn't have done it without you.
Thank you. Thank you, Greg. That's great. And yes, echoing my thanks to everyone who filled in the survey, which is obviously really important. We've got about 20 minutes for conversation. I mean, I think it's really stark, Greg. By the way, I also love that phrase about we help people to like their lives. I think that's really powerful. That's look, it's really stark research. It's quite grim reading on the state of Scottish local government finance. It's quite grim reading in terms of interactions with Scottish government. But there is, I think, as Greg pulled out, a lot of positivity there as well. About there are ideas coming from the sector about what we need to do to move forwards. There's a confidence about how, what an amazing job local government could do if some of these barriers were removed. So important not, I think, to get into a sort of council of despair around this. It's a sort of wake-up call. It's a kind of moment that we need to take seriously, but it's also potentially the sort of beginning of something else. Look, questions for Greg, welcome, but also discussion points, how does that resonate?